Are you drinking, man, Reverend?
Yeah, it doesn't help.
No, I suppose not. Can God forgive us? For what we've done to this world?
That clip is from Paul Schrader's film First Reformed. In this scene, we have Ethan Hawke's character Reverend Toller, who has been summoned by the wife of this guy here, Michael, whose recent emotional turbulence is the reason for their meeting. You see, Michael is an unstable environmental activist and who recently found out that his wife is pregnant, and this discovery has put him at a crossroads. In Michael's mind, given the looming doom that the future promises, with geopolitical conflicts, the threat and irreversibility of environmental collapse, how can one justifiably bring a child into this world as it were, or finally rubble as it may become? And this is what I want to talk about today, the morality/immorality of procreation, of bringing a child into the world. Is it moral expediency or necessity? Well, first, let us go back in time to the Elizabethan era, to the era of one of history's finest poets, William Shakespeare. And I don't mean to take you back to grade 9 English class. In Hamlet, one of the most critically acclaimed English plays of all time, Prince Hamlet, in Act 3, Scene 1, delivers a speech that would forever echo in the annals of art and literature. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing, end them, to die, to sleep no more, and by sleep, to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished, to die, to sleep. Hamlet's monologue here is not only a meditation on the nature of death, but also life. Hamlet contemplates the trade-off of existence versus non-existence, to be or not to be. That because of the omnipresence of suffering and pain in the world, the toil of human struggle, physical decay, to continue existing on the face of it would be a fruitless endeavor, a mere prolongment of unhappiness. He dreams of the delights of eternal sleep, but is afraid that annihilation may not be guaranteed, because we cannot know really if death is the end. Now this passage is also referenced in another work that I want to talk about, Studies in Pessimism, by one of the darkest philosophers in history, and, unironically, one of my favorites, the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. In the very first line of this work, Schopenhauer says the following: "Unless suffering is the immediate and direct object of life, our existence must entirely fail of its aim. That if existence is supposedly intrinsically good or valuable, as if the universe were spinning on the axis of some platonic idea of happiness or the good, then something has gone majorly wrong, because of the fact that the world is, well." He then goes on to say, "The pleasure in this world, it has been said, outweighs the pain, or at any rate, there is an even balance between the two. If the reader wishes shortly to see if this statement is true, let him compare the respective feelings of two animals, one of which is engaged in eating the other." And I know what you're thinking, like, gee, why is this guy so miserable? Did someone break this guy's heart? Well, probably not. In fact, Schopenhauer was quite known for his misogyny, so much so that on one occasion he pushed an old lady down a flight of stairs because she was talking too loudly. So, it's probably not that. I just think he thinks, existence sucks. But in all seriousness, it's quite a damning comparison. Now let's look even closer, right? I want you to try and imagine the greatest conceivable pleasure you could hypothetically experience, where you're sublimely enraptured. Now imagine you could experience this pleasure for 10 whole minutes, but after doing so, you would then have to experience 1 minute of the gravest, most intense suffering imaginable. The question is, would you do it? Well, probably not, but let's say you would be willing. To be more specific, would you put your hand on a hot stove for a full minute if it meant that you could experience 10 minutes of the most sublime pleasure imaginable? Again, probably not, and yet this example would be child's play compared to the worst possible suffering. This is because the intensity of suffering dwarfs our sensitivity to pleasure and leaves its mark more indelibly than pleasure. It is along this line of reasoning that the South African philosopher David Benatar makes his case for anti-natalism in his book Better Never to Have Been, because apparently we got philosophers here in South Africa. Anti-natalism is the view that the procreation of sentient life is wrong, based on the grounds that coming into existence is always a harm. So in the case of humans, this applies to not having children. This also applies to animals, or again, anything that is sentient or conscious. This brings us full circle to that scene again of Michael and the Reverend Tola. The subtext here is not merely a commentary on abortions, but an allusion to the greater philosophical question about the value of life itself, the postmodern tendency towards nihilism, and the morality of procreation altogether. While this question has experienced limited popularity throughout human history, it has taken on a new significance in the 21st century. Whereas in the past, the question of bringing life into the world may have been critically posed against the backdrops of famine, wars, disease outbreaks, economic collapse, during previous eras where life was often brutal and short. Nowadays, suffering is less about basic survival and more about the long-term consequences of existence. Because while the mean quality of life has undoubtedly increased since earlier ages with technological advancements, lower infant mortality, and better access to healthcare and food, it is superimposed against new concerns about the environment, AI, biological warfare, and the prevalence of psychological suffering that continues despite the relative stability of modern life. You see, like Arthur Schopenhauer, Benatar believes that the character of existence is such that the badness of it outweighs the good. There is more suffering than there is pleasure, more evil than there is good. This is a nice segue into Benatar's Axiological asymmetry, an argument which states that the experience of pleasure is good and the experience of pain is bad. But in the case of a non-existent being, the absence of pleasure is neither good nor bad, but simply neutral, because there isn't anyone being deprived of pleasure in the case of someone who doesn't yet exist. Whereas the absence of pain is good because the avoidance of suffering altogether is a positive in and of itself. Now, this claim is often touted by critics of antinatalism as logically fallacious or inconsistent or incoherent. Because how in the case of non-existence is the absence of pleasure neutral, but then the absence of suffering is good? Doesn't the neutrality of non-existence extend not only to pleasure, but also to pain? Well, to this, Benatar would say that we cannot apply logical, normal reasoning to cases which themselves are abnormal. And so while this critique would maybe have some applicable grounds in the case of someone who does exist, we are talking about someone who doesn't yet exist. And not only that, we are contemplating the possibility of them coming into existence. And it is based off of this possibility that Benatar argues that the absence of pain in the case of a non-existent being is good, because it's not that the neutrality of non-existence is itself a positive, but in the comparative scenario of having existed, in that context, non-existence becomes a good and a positive. Because if they were to come into existence, they would suffer. And yes, they would maybe experience pleasure as well. But in the case of someone who doesn't exist, the absence of that pleasure won't really affect them or harm them. And yet we can say, because if someone were to come into existence, that they would suffer, we can then say that for the non-existent being, as they do not yet exist, and they are avoiding the possibility of coming into existence, they are thereby avoiding the suffering that would be a result thereof, making the absence of pain in this case good. And the magnitude and quantity of suffering in this case is irrelevant, because at any rate, suffering is guaranteed. You know, whether a person's life might turn out to be good is a possibility, but suffering is an inevitability. While people may retroactively read meaning into their mortal wounds, on a metaphysical analysis, Benatar would say that the simple inevitability of suffering makes existence an unjustifiable gamble. And the 20th century Romanian philosopher Emil Cioran shared this pessimism along with Benatar, except in his case, he was even more radical. You see, to Emil Cioran, existence was a grand cosmic error. He viewed birth as a catastrophe, consciousness as a meaningless accident in our biological and evolutionary chain, similar to the sentiments expressed by Russ Cole in True Detective.
I think human consciousness was a tragic misstep in evolution. We became too self-aware. Nature created an aspect of nature separate from itself. We are creatures that should not exist by natural law.
To Cioran, there is no escape, there is no hope of liberation, because ultimately he views all those things as an extension of the absolute absurdity of existence. While in the case of the 20th century French philosopher Albert Camus, viewing the absurdity of life as a reason to almost embrace existence and embrace that meaninglessness, Cioran would view this absurdist philosophy as another attempt by humans to try and rationalize the meaninglessness of their existence. He ultimately saw everything as completely and utterly futile, and that the only thing someone could ultimately do was crawl into the corner of their room and not participate in existence altogether, to rebel against life's theatricality and absurdity. Cioran was the absolute embodiment of nihilism. If we were to take nihilism to its logical conclusion, you would end up with Emil Cioran. And so with all this in mind, Cioran viewed coming into existence equally harshly as David Benatar. It is curious that while good people go to great lengths to spare their children from suffering, few of them seem to notice that the one and only guaranteed way to prevent all the suffering of their children is not to bring those children into existence in the first place. And it is this existential worry that is the catalyst for the declining birth rates around the world, particularly in the West. You see, while the birth rate in Africa is still around the same or increasing, in countries like the United States, Canada, and South Korea, there have been exponential declines in fertility rates, with South Korea in particular with a staggering birth rate of almost 6 births per woman from the year 1960, spiraling all the way down to just 0.78 births per woman as of 2022, not even at replacement level. People aren't just simply not having kids out of mere disinterest or even for selfish reasons, but rather the opposite, and for philanthropic reasons. Because of looming global uncertainties, there is a reluctance from younger generations to bring a child into the world. On the other side of this debate are the fervent pronatalists, who not only want children but to bang out as many as possible. That because of declining fertility rates, a baby boom is in more need than ever before. In an article titled "Problem with Pronatalism, Pushing Baby Booms to Boost Economic Growth Amounts to a Ponzi Scheme," it goes over some of these issues. In the face of shrinking populations, many of the world's major economies are trying to engineer higher birth rates. Among these proponents are the likes of Elon Musk, Donald Trump, along with other Western and Eastern powers. The pronatalist movement is, we believe, inherently misguided. It is premised on the belief that ever larger populations are needed to spur economic growth, which alone will lift individuals and communities out of poverty. Seen this way, pronatalism is a Ponzi scheme. It relies on new entrants to produce returns for earlier investors, with the burdens falling most heavily on women, who are responsible for the bulk of childbearing and child rearing, often without adequate medical care or affordable childcare. But that amounts to borrowing from the future to pay the debts of the past. In this context, however, children are merely a means to an end and not ends in themselves, being implicitly treated as economic assets in negation of their autonomy. Because the anti-natalist refrains from procreation for the sake of that potential person, whereas pronatalism says,
oh well, we need to sustain the economy or something.
Which is itself completely morally abhorrent, and is another element of the popular mindless calculations people make, or lack thereof, in regards to having children. This gets us onto the topic of consent, a right nowadays often viewed as inviolable. In the case of the non-existent being, do they consent to being born, exiting their harmless slumber? Well, you might say obviously they can't, but that is kind of the whole point. You cannot have a child for the child's sake, because on one hand, a non-existent being cannot have any interests and cannot consent to being born, and on the other hand, you're assuming that their lives will for the most part turn out to be good. But let's look at that. How can a person know how their child's life will turn out? What if that potential child, if they were to come into existence, would suffer tremendously in the forms of economic misfortune, existential despair, an untreatable illness, or some unretractable mental disorder? You might say that if we were able to foresee the suffering, then of course we wouldn't have had the child in the first place. Yet, people still go on to have kids despite the fact that they can't foresee the pleasure that they suppose this child will go on to experience. And so really you're going off of chance when making this prediction, which an antinatalist would argue as being an unjustifiable gamble. But stepping back from abstract philosophy for a second, what other reasons are there that possibly explain the decline in fertility rates around the world? Well, how about let's first talk about climate change, where literally just last month in February we had the third hottest February ever recorded, with temperatures ranking 1.59 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Or how about we go back to February again to look at global sea ice levels, where literally just last month again we reached all-time minimums in terms of global sea ice levels, with Arctic sea ice levels at 8% below average and Antarctic levels at 26% below average. And so it shouldn't be a surprise that people aren't necessarily impartial to the environmental concerns that are plaguing humanity at the moment, because frankly, in one sense, we are one of the first generations that can actually do stuff about climate change, at least to a respectable degree, and yet things in many respects are getting progressively worse. In fact, we still have people in relatively high positions of power who claim that climate change is largely a hoax. I don't know what to say at that point. I guess there will just have to be cyclones and tsunamis for people to maybe take the stuff remotely seriously. Not like there hasn't been any of that over the last few years, but Hey man, who knows, who knows? You know, the same people who claim that all the worry and all the calls to action are just by fear-mongering radical environmentalists who want to see humanity extinct for the benefit of the world, or because it's not as if the consequences of environmental negligence are dire, surely not. Now, from a different perspective as well, having children is more of a sacrifice than it used to be. With the playing field becoming more equal over time, women generally have more opportunities available to them and different paths to take than even 100 years ago. Whereas having a child in the past may have been one of the few silver linings in the uninterrupted stillness of a woman's life, where childbearing was hardly a choice as much as it was an expectation, now women are afforded the chances of education and economic dependence, granting women the sovereignty to live their lives on their own accord. And so in many cases, some women just simply choose not to have children, as they might not be willing to put some of their other commitments on the back burner, or because of the costs involved in having a child, not having full confidence in their abilities to adequately provide. I mean, just take a look at this graph which shows the growth of childcare expenses since 1998 in the US. While costs like child apparel have either at times slightly decreased or remained the same, every other expense has almost doubled since then, increasing more than the rate of inflation. So nowadays, it's also just way more expensive to have kids compared to previous generations. And the paradox here is this. Kids are obviously a lot of work and require a lot of time, energy, and resources. The costs of raising a child have skyrocketed in recent years, meaning that one, if not both parents, have to work full-time jobs just to simply be able to take care of the child. Except that the trade-off ends up being that they spend less time with their children in the first place. And so it is the amalgamation of all these confounding variables which have led us to this point. And you can't really be mad at people. I mean, just look around you. I'd rather there be hesitation about having children than be in a society where its only concern is its continuation, no matter the direction civilization may be headed. To pass the mess that we've created onto the next generation's shoulders, thus perpetuating the cycle again and again, until we reach the point of no return. You see, none of us ask to come into existence. We are thrown into the world, as it were, and are left to fend for ourselves and trudge on forward. As the existentialists would say, we are condemned to be free, because we didn't create ourselves, and yet are nevertheless at liberty, and from the moment of our inception, we are responsible for everything that we do from that point onwards. Whereas in a trial, a criminal might be condemned to death, all of existing humanity is condemned to life. Arthur Schopenhauer once asked, if children were brought into the world by an act of pure reason alone, would the human race continue to exist? Would not a man rather have so much sympathy with the coming generation as to spare it the burden of existence, or at any rate, not impose that burden upon it in cold blood? You see, society is changing, the culture is different, and the future more and more unclear. This isn't a call to antinatalism or the opposite. But at the very least, if we are going to continue having kids, we have to address some of the uncertainties of the future and some of the ecological and societal problems that currently plague humanity, instead of filtering our misfortune down the hereditary chain onto the next generation's shoulders. And I think slowly, but surely, we are moving in that direction. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time.